It wasn't love. You were a mistake, said the Millionaire CEO, but 3 years later, he saw the proof of love staring back at him, with her eyes. Alexander Pierce stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, the city stretched beneath him like a living organism of light and motion. From this height, everything looked small, manageable, under control, just the way he liked it. He was the man who built empires out of steel and glass, who dictated the rhythm of progress, who believed that emotions were liabilities for people without ambition. His reflection in the glass looked as cold as the night outside, sharp suit, perfect hair, blue eyes that never betrayed weakness. Behind him, Claire stood in silence, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her heart together. She had come hoping for understanding, maybe even forgiveness, but deep down she already knew how this would end. When Alexander finally turned to her, his voice was calm and measured, the same tone he used to close business deals. "It wasn't love, Claire," he said, each word landing with deliberate cruelty. "You were a mistake." For a moment, her face didn't move, but her eyes, those deep green eyes, widened slightly, as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. He expected her to cry, to plead, to beg him to take it back. Instead, she simply nodded. "Then I hope you never make the same mistake twice," she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady enough to make him flinch. He didn't show it. He stood motionless as she walked past him, her heels clicking against the marble floor, the faint scent of jasmine lingering in the air long after the door closed behind her. When she was gone, Alexander exhaled and poured himself a drink. He told himself it was the right thing to do. Love, whatever it was, only distracted people. He had built everything on logic and control, and he wasn't about to risk it all for a woman who made him feel things he didn't understand. Feelings couldn't be trusted. They clouded judgment, made people weak, and he had sworn long ago that he would never be weak again. As the night deepened, he stood alone in the quiet apartment, the city lights reflecting off the glass, and tried to ignore the faint echo of her voice still ringing in his mind. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire sat in a small diner with a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in her hands. The streets were nearly deserted, rain tapping softly against the windows. Her reflection looked tired, almost unrecognizable. She had loved him so completely, so foolishly, believing that somewhere beneath his walls there was a heart that could love her back. She was wrong. She had always known he was ambitious, that his world revolved around power and perfection, but she had also believed that she could be part of that world if she loved him enough. Now, as the truth settled in, she realized that love had never been part of his vocabulary. When she finally returned home, she packed her things in silence. There wasn't much, some clothes, a few books, a photo of the two of them taken before he became the man who measured life in profit margins. She looked at that picture for a long time before setting it face down on the table. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and let the tears come. They weren't just for him. They were for the version of herself who had believed in fairy tales, in redemption, in the idea that love could change a man like Alexander Pierce. Days turned into weeks. She left her job, sold what she could, and moved to a quiet coastal town several hours away. The air there was cleaner, the people simpler, and the sea always sounded like forgiveness. She found work in a small flower shop owned by an elderly widow who didn't ask questions. It suited her. The scent of fresh blooms and earth reminded her that life could still be gentle, even when the heart was not. And yet, every night, when she closed her eyes, she saw him, standing tall and untouchable, his voice cold and final. "You were a mistake." Those words haunted her dreams, looping endlessly until they lost their meaning and became only sound. A month later, when she noticed she hadn't been sleeping well, she blamed stress. When food began to make her nauseous, she thought it was exhaustion. But when she missed her second cycle, a quiet dread began to bloom inside her. She bought a test, hands shaking as she waited for the result. When she saw the 2 lines appear, the world tilted. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She pressed a hand against her stomach, feeling nothing yet, but knowing everything had changed. There was no anger, only disbelief, followed by a wave of fierce, trembling resolve. She sat by the window that night, watching the moonlight spill across the floor, and whispered to herself, "You're not a mistake." It was the first time she had spoken since the test, and her voice broke as she said it again, firmer this time. "You're not a mistake." She didn't know what the future would look like, or how she would manage on her own, but she knew one thing: she would never let Alexander Pierce's words define her child. Whatever came next, it would be hers to protect, to love, to build a life for. Back in the city, Alexander barely noticed her absence. He told himself that she had moved on, that it was for the best. He buried himself in work, filling his calendar with meetings, flights, and deadlines until there was no space left for reflection. Yet, sometimes, late at night when the office was empty and the city below him was reduced to shadows and noise, a thought would flicker through his mind: how quiet she had been when she left. No tears, no anger, just silence. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. But he always pushed it away, reminding himself that emotions were irrelevant, that love was a distraction, and that he had done what needed to be done. Neither of them knew that the choice made that night would echo through their lives for years to come, shaping everything that would follow. He thought he had erased her. She thought she had escaped him. But fate, with its strange patience, had already begun to draw the lines that would one day bring them back together, different, broken, and ready to learn what love truly meant. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Alexander's office, spilling light across polished marble floors and expensive furniture that seemed too perfect to touch. The city stretched endlessly beyond the skyline, humming with life and ambition. Alexander sat at his desk, reviewing documents with mechanical precision, his mind focused, his expression unreadable. The assistants outside his door spoke in hushed voices. Everyone knew that the CEO of Pierce Holdings was not a man to interrupt unless it was a matter of importance. He was efficient, sharp, and relentlessly disciplined. Yet lately, there was something different about him, though no one could quite name it. He worked later than usual, his temper shorter, his silences longer. He didn't realize it, but the emptiness he had cultivated for years had started to close in on him like a shadow. He had told himself that success required sacrifice, that emotions were a cost he couldn't afford. And by all appearances, he had everything: money, respect, control. His company had just won a government contract that would make him even wealthier, his name was on every business magazine's front page, and his investors trusted him blindly. Yet when he came home at night to his sterile apartment, there was a silence that pressed against his chest, something hollow that even the sound of the city couldn't fill. He would pour himself a drink, watch the skyline, and feel nothing. Or perhaps he felt too much, he wasn't sure anymore. Sometimes, without warning, his mind drifted to her. Claire. It always annoyed him when it happened, and yet he couldn't stop it. He would remember the way she used to stand in his office doorway, smiling quietly, never demanding his attention but somehow having it anyway. He would hear her laugh, soft but genuine, the kind of sound that had no place in his world of suits and deadlines. It was absurd how something so small could linger. He had erased her, he reminded himself. He had done what was necessary. Still, the ghost of her presence remained, haunting the corners of his neatly controlled life. One evening, after another long day of meetings, he returned home and found the scent of jasmine in the elevator, a perfume that some stranger must have worn, but it froze him in place. It was her scent, delicate and unmistakable. His throat tightened as he stepped into his penthouse, the silence now unbearable. He poured himself another drink, but the taste felt bitter. He thought about calling someone, maybe a colleague, maybe one of the women he occasionally saw, to avoid being completely alone. Yet the thought of meaningless conversation made him feel even more tired. He stood by the window, watching the city lights, and for the first time, wondered if maybe he had been wrong about something. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Claire was building a new rhythm of life. The coastal town where she had settled was small and quiet, the kind of place where people smiled to each other on the street and time seemed to move slower. The flower shop where she worked sat on the corner of a cobblestone street, filled with the scent of roses and lavender. The owner, Mrs. Whitaker, was a kind woman with silver hair and a soft voice who treated Claire like a daughter but never pried into her past. Claire liked it that way. The routine soothed her, arranging flowers, serving customers, closing the shop at dusk, and walking home through the soft ocean breeze. Her pregnancy was beginning to show now, a gentle curve that she tried to hide under loose dresses. At first, she feared the stares, the questions, but no one judged her. The townspeople didn't care who she had been or why she was alone, they simply accepted her. In the evenings, she would sit by the shore, watching the tide roll in, her hands resting protectively on her stomach. She would whisper things to the baby, little promises she wasn't sure she could keep but wanted to believe in. She talked about the sea, the flowers, the stars, and sometimes, though she hated herself for it, about him. There were nights when she dreamt of Alexander, though the dreams never ended well. In some, he reached for her only to turn to glass and shatter in her hands. In others, he walked away, and no matter how far she ran, she couldn't catch up. She would wake with tears on her face and tell herself it didn't matter. She didn't need him. Her child would be loved enough for two. Yet beneath the strength she forced herself to show, there was a quiet ache that wouldn't leave, a wound that didn't heal because part of her still didn't understand how someone could claim love was a weakness after knowing what it felt like. As months passed, the baby became her world. She began to talk to her growing belly as if it were a secret friend. "You'll be kind," she would whisper at night, tracing gentle circles on her skin. "You'll laugh easily. You'll have his eyes, maybe, but not his heart. Yours will be better." Sometimes she wondered if that was true, if children could inherit more than looks. She hoped not. She prayed that whatever part of Alexander lived in her child would only be the good she once believed existed in him. Back in the city, Alexander's life grew busier but strangely heavier. He no longer found satisfaction in his victories. His friends and colleagues praised his drive, his vision, but he felt detached from it all. There were moments when he would see a child with its mother on the street, and something unfamiliar would twist in his chest. He didn't know what it was, but it lingered long after he turned away. Sometimes, he would catch himself wondering what Claire was doing, where she was, if she hated him or had simply forgotten him altogether. He told himself it didn't matter, yet the question persisted like a quiet hum at the back of his mind. Late one night, after a dinner with investors, he returned to his apartment and found himself staring at the framed photo on his desk. It was from 3 years ago, taken at a charity event. Claire was beside him, smiling in that soft way she had, unaware that he was looking at her instead of the camera. He had never bothered to remove the photo. For years, he hadn't even noticed it. But now, the sight of it unsettled him. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the glass. For a moment, he thought about throwing it away. Instead, he set it face down, poured another drink, and stood in silence, the sound of the rain outside tapping against the window like an unanswered question. He told himself that he was fine, that this was just fatigue. Yet when he went to bed that night, he dreamed of her again, not as the woman he had dismissed, but as she was the last time he saw her, standing proud and heartbroken, her eyes filled with everything he refused to feel. When he woke, his chest ached as if something inside him had shifted, though he couldn't name what it was. Somewhere, far away, as the waves crashed softly against the shore, Claire stirred in her sleep, unaware that in a city of glass and steel, the man who once destroyed her was beginning, in the smallest, quietest way, to unravel. The storm that had swept through the coast overnight had left the town washed clean by morning, the streets glistening with dew and the sea air carrying a faint chill that hinted at early autumn. Claire stood by the window of her small apartment, holding a cup of tea, her gaze on the horizon where the sky met the water. The baby had been born 3 months earlier, a little girl she named Lily. The first time she held her, everything inside her shifted. The fear, the loneliness, the anger, all of it dissolved the moment those tiny fingers wrapped around hers. Lily had Alexander's eyes, impossibly blue and bright, and every time Claire looked into them, her heart ached with a confusing mix of love and loss. She wanted to hate that part of him, but she couldn't. Those eyes were innocent, pure, untouched by his cruelty. They belonged entirely to her child, not to the man who had walked away. The early months were hard. There were nights when Lily cried for hours and Claire cried with her, her exhaustion pressing like a weight she couldn't escape. Money was tight, sleep was rare, and her body still ached from childbirth. Yet even in those moments, when the world felt too heavy, one smile from Lily made everything bearable. She had learned to live one day at a time, balancing work at the flower shop with motherhood. Mrs. Whittaker helped her when she could, rocking the baby in the back room while Claire arranged bouquets, humming softly to calm them both. The older woman never asked about Lily's father, though sometimes Claire caught the understanding in her eyes, a quiet empathy that didn't need words. One afternoon, as the autumn sun warmed the shop's windows, a couple came in to order flowers for their anniversary. Claire greeted them with her usual calm smile, but as she wrapped their bouquet, she caught sight of their joined hands and felt an unexpected pang in her chest. She wasn't bitter, not anymore, but the sight of love, steady, simple, and real, made her realize how deeply she had once believed in something that never existed. When the couple left, she sat for a long while in the quiet shop, her hands resting on the counter, and whispered to herself, "You're enough, Claire. You have to be." At night, when Lily slept, she would take out her sketchbook. She had always loved to draw but had stopped during her time with Alexander, when every day felt too busy and every dream too far away. Now, she filled the pages with sketches of the sea, the town, and most often, her daughter. There was peace in those quiet hours, the soft scratching of the pencil against paper and the steady rhythm of Lily's breathing beside her. Still, sometimes she caught herself imagining what it would be like if he knew. Would he care? Would he look at their daughter and see what he had done, or would he turn away as easily as before? She shook off the thought each time, convincing herself that it didn't matter. He wasn't part of this world anymore. He had chosen his life of power and isolation, and she had chosen hers of love and resilience. In the city, Alexander's empire grew, but his restlessness grew with it. He spent his days surrounded by people yet felt utterly alone. He had dated women since Claire, beautiful and ambitious, the kind who understood the language of success, but none of them stayed long. They found him distant, distracted, unreachable. He couldn't explain to them that something inside him had gone numb, that every time he thought he was close to feeling again, the memory of a pair of green eyes would stop him. He had buried his guilt under layers of work and noise, but it always found him in the silence. He began waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding, haunted by dreams he couldn't fully remember. Sometimes, they were of Claire. Sometimes, of a child he didn't recognize, a small voice calling out to him that vanished before he could respond. During one of his sleepless nights, he wandered through his penthouse, stopping at the piano in the corner of the room. He hadn't played in years, not since before he met her. His fingers rested on the keys for a moment before pressing down, the soft notes filling the empty space. The melody came back to him slowly, hesitant, like a language he had forgotten how to speak. As the music carried through the room, he closed his eyes and saw her face, the way she looked at him that last night, not with anger but with quiet disappointment. It pierced through the wall he had built around himself, leaving him breathless. He stopped playing and stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, realizing that everything he touched turned cold eventually. The next morning, he went to the office early. His assistant handed him a list of meetings, but he barely heard her. His thoughts drifted constantly, and his focus was slipping. His business partner, Daniel, noticed the change. "You look like hell," he said half-jokingly during a meeting. "When's the last time you took a break?" Alexander gave a hollow laugh. Brakes are for people who can afford to stop, he said, but even as he said it, he knew how empty it sounded. He worked to stay distracted, but the cracks in his composure were beginning to show. Back by the coast, the days turned colder. The first frost appeared on the windows, and Lily began to crawl, her laughter filling their little home. Claire had never known joy like that before. She would sit on the floor with her daughter, building towers out of wooden blocks and pretending to be surprised every time Lily knocked them down. It was simple, imperfect, and yet it felt like the truest kind of happiness. Still, there were moments, late at night when the world was quiet, when Claire found herself watching her child sleep and feeling the weight of what she had lost. Not Alexander himself, but the dream she once carried, that love could fix everything, that people could change because you believed in them. Then one evening, while closing the shop, she heard a little boy passing by with his mother, asking questions about his father. "Where does Daddy go at night?" he said, and his mother smiled patiently, explaining that he worked hard so they could live well. Claire froze, her heart clenching in her chest. She didn't know what she would tell Lily one day when she asked the same question. She didn't know how to explain that her father was alive but absent, that he had chosen pride over love. As she locked the shop and stepped into the cold air, she looked up at the stars and whispered, "Please let her never feel what I felt." Far away, in a high-rise apartment surrounded by glass and silence, Alexander looked out at the same night sky, unaware that the woman he had once called a mistake was looking at the same stars, holding the child he didn't know existed. Their worlds were miles apart, yet somehow, fate was already beginning to pull their paths toward each other again, slowly, quietly, with the patience only time could understand. By the time Lily turned 2, life in the coastal town had found a fragile rhythm that felt almost peaceful. The mornings began with the scent of salt in the air and the sound of waves hitting the shore just beyond the flower shop. Claire had learned to juggle motherhood and work, and though she was often exhausted, there was a quiet pride in knowing she had built something real from nothing. Lily was curious and bright, a child who laughed easily and ran everywhere as if afraid the world might disappear if she didn't explore it fast enough. Her hair had deepened into a warm chestnut, soft curls catching the sunlight, and her blue eyes still held that unearthly clarity that sometimes made Claire's heart ache. Every time she looked at her daughter, she saw both love and loss, a reminder of what once was, and what had been born from it. Claire's evenings were the hardest. After Lily had gone to sleep, she would sit by the small table near the window with a cup of tea, her gaze drifting between the moonlit ocean and the half-finished sketches on the page before her. There were moments when loneliness crept in uninvited, whispering doubts that she tried to silence. She had chosen this life, but choice didn't always erase the ache. Sometimes she would imagine Alexander somewhere far away, surrounded by people and success, his life continuing untouched, while she was here, forgotten, invisible, raising a child who carried his eyes. Then guilt would follow, because no matter how much she resented him, she would never regret what he had given her. Lily was her reason, her redemption. Meanwhile, Alexander's world was beginning to crack in ways he didn't understand. His empire still stood, his reputation untarnished, but there was a growing emptiness beneath the surface that he could no longer ignore. He moved through his days like a machine, precise and detached, but the satisfaction that once came with power was gone. At social events, he played his part flawlessly, smiles, handshakes, the polished confidence of a man who had everything. Yet when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, he felt nothing. His penthouse, with its panoramic view of the city, had become a cage made of glass and silence. He didn't know when it started, but lately he found himself noticing things he used to overlook: the laughter of a child on the street below his office window, the way the morning light touched the buildings, the quiet moments between meetings when the world seemed to pause. He had always dismissed sentimentality as weakness, but something inside him was shifting, pulling him toward emotions he didn't know how to name. Once, while passing a park on his way to a meeting, he saw a young mother sitting on a bench, holding her child. The sight struck him unexpectedly hard. The tenderness in her expression, the way the child reached up to touch her face, it stirred something in him that left him unsettled for the rest of the day. That night, he dreamed again. He was walking through fog, calling out for someone he couldn't see. Then, faintly, he heard laughter, a child's laughter, and turned to find a little girl running ahead of him, her small hand reaching back toward him. He ran after her, but she kept slipping further away, her figure dissolving into light. When he woke, his heart was pounding. He sat up in bed, the dream clinging to him like mist, and for the first time in years, he felt afraid, of what he had done, of what he might have lost without even knowing it. The following weeks brought no relief. He threw himself deeper into work, trying to drown the unease, but even his colleagues noticed the difference. Daniel, his longtime business partner, confronted him one afternoon. "You look like hell, Alex. When's the last time you took a break?" Alexander brushed him off with a humorless smile, claiming he didn't have time for distractions, but the truth was that the work no longer distracted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of a woman with brown hair and green eyes, her voice echoing from some distant memory. He had convinced himself that love was a mistake, but now, even in its absence, it haunted him more than its presence ever had. One evening, after a long day at the office, he decided to walk home instead of taking his car. The city felt different at night, quieter, more honest somehow. The people he passed didn't recognize him; to them, he was just another man in a dark suit. For a moment, he envied them, their anonymity, their simple exhaustion, the fact that they could walk home to someone who waited for them. When he reached his building, he hesitated before stepping inside, a thought flickering through his mind: what if he had been wrong all along? What if success meant nothing without someone to share it with? Back by the coast, Claire was preparing for Lily's 3rd birthday. She had saved every spare dollar, determined to give her daughter a day to remember. The celebration was small, a handful of neighbors, a homemade cake, a few balloons, but the joy on Lily's face made it feel like magic. As the guests left and the sun began to set, Claire sat with her daughter on the porch steps, the sea breeze lifting strands of their hair. Lily leaned against her and said in a sleepy voice, "Mommy, do I have a daddy?" The question pierced through her like a blade. She froze for a moment before replying softly, "You have me, sweetheart. And that's enough." But later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Claire sat alone in the dark, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had done her best to bury the past, yet it had a way of returning through the mouth of an innocent child. She didn't know that on the same night, in a city hundreds of miles away, Alexander stood on his balcony, looking out at the endless skyline, a drink untouched in his hand. The wind was cold, the stars faint, and for the first time in years, he whispered her name. He didn't know why. He told himself it was just a memory surfacing, nothing more. But deep down, something in him was beginning to wake, a quiet voice that had been silent too long, whispering that the life he had built was not victory, but punishment. Neither of them knew it yet, but the distance between them was already starting to close. The same fate that had once torn them apart was slowly, patiently, preparing to bring them back together again. The wind in the city carried the faint scent of rain that morning, brushing against the glass walls of Alexander's office as if trying to break through. He stood by the window with a coffee he hadn't touched, his reflection ghosting against the skyline. Meetings filled his calendar, reports waited on his desk, and his phone blinked with messages that demanded his attention, but none of it seemed to matter. There was an emptiness that success no longer masked. He had spent years building everything people admired, yet there wasn't a single person he could call and simply talk to. He had thought solitude meant control, that it made him untouchable, but now it only felt like punishment. He wondered, not for the first time, where Claire might be, if she had moved on, if she hated him, or if she thought of him at all. He hated himself for wondering. The idea of her still having power over him infuriated him, but beneath that anger was guilt, sharp and constant. Later that day, he attended a charity event his company sponsored every year. He shook hands, gave a polished speech, and posed for photographs. The applause felt hollow. As he walked through the crowd afterward, his gaze caught on a little girl playing near the stage. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old, with curls the color of sunlight and eyes so bright they seemed to hold the whole world inside them. For a split second, his chest tightened with something he couldn't explain. The girl turned and laughed at something her mother said, and he felt a strange ache run through him. The mother's gentle expression, the way she looked at her child, it stirred something buried deep, a longing he didn't know how to name. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that child's face, and behind it, another, one he had tried to forget. Across the coast, life had become steady for Claire and Lily. The flower shop continued to grow, and the locals adored her work. She had learned to smile again, though there were still moments when old memories surfaced unexpectedly, like faint scars that would never quite fade. Lily had grown into a curious, energetic child who loved to chase seagulls by the shore and pick wildflowers for her mother. She was the light of every room she entered, and Claire often found herself thinking that her daughter carried something pure that neither pain nor time could touch. On Sundays, they would walk along the pier, Lily's small hand gripping hers tightly, and for those few hours, Claire allowed herself to believe they were complete. She had convinced herself that their little world was enough. But fate rarely leaves peace undisturbed. One afternoon, while Claire and Lily were in town, a group of developers arrived to discuss plans for a new coastal resort. Claire overheard them while delivering flowers to the local cafe. Their leader's name made her heart stop, Pierce Holdings. Her pulse quickened, her hands trembling as she set the bouquet on the counter. It couldn't be him, she thought. There were other Pierces in the world. But the name, the company, the way it was said, it sounded too familiar. That night, after putting Lily to bed, she searched the name online on her old laptop. The first thing she saw was his face. Alexander Pierce. His photograph stared back at her from a business article about expansion projects and record-breaking profits. He looked older, sharper somehow, but still unmistakably him. The sight sent a shiver through her. For years, she had built her life on the belief that their paths would never cross again. Now, the possibility of it terrified her. In the city, Alexander had no idea how close he was to her world. He had agreed to personally inspect the land where the resort would be built. When his assistant mentioned the coastal town, he barely looked up from his papers. "Schedule it next week," he said, unaware that fate was already guiding him toward a place he thought he'd never see. The following Monday, he arrived with a small team, the air sharp with salt and wind. As the car drove through the narrow streets, something in him stirred, a strange familiarity, as if he had been there before in another life. He didn't know why the sound of the ocean made his chest tighten. Meanwhile, Claire tried to keep her composure, but the tension was impossible to hide. Mrs. Whittaker noticed immediately. "You've been distracted, dear," she said gently as they arranged tulips together. Claire smiled weakly and changed the subject. That night, she dreamed of him for the first time in years. In the dream, he stood by the sea, looking lost, his voice quiet when he said her name. When she woke, her heart was pounding. She went to Lily's room and watched her sleep, her small body curled up beneath a blanket covered in stars. "You'll never know that pain," Claire whispered. "Not if I can help it." The next morning dawned gray and misty. Alexander stepped out of his car near the site and inhaled deeply. The air was different from the city's, it smelled alive, full of salt and memory. As he walked along the cliffs with the project manager, his eyes caught movement below, a woman pushing a stroller along the boardwalk. He couldn't see her face clearly, but something about her posture, the curve of her shoulders, made his heartbeat quicken. He forced himself to look away, dismissing the thought. Yet all day, that image stayed with him. When he stopped by the town square later, something drew him toward a small flower shop on the corner. It looked warm and inviting, filled with bursts of color even in the dull light of afternoon. A woman stood inside, arranging flowers, her hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. He stepped closer, the bell above the door ringing softly as he entered. She turned, and time stopped. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Her face was the same, though softer now, older in a way that made her even more beautiful. Her green eyes widened, shock flickering across them before she composed herself. He felt every breath leave his body as he whispered, "Claire." She stood still, her hands gripping the counter, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, unable to find words. "I didn't know. I didn't expect." He looked around as if the room itself could explain what he was feeling. "You live here?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes. For 3 years now." He wanted to say something, anything, but before he could, a small voice called from the back room. "Mommy." A little girl appeared, her blue eyes bright, her smile wide. She ran toward Claire and wrapped her arms around her leg. Alexander froze, his world narrowing to the child before him. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes. The same hair. His breath caught as realization crashed into him, leaving him speechless. Claire met his gaze then, her expression calm but guarded. "This is Lily," she said quietly. "My daughter." He couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. Every wall he had ever built around himself crumbled in an instant. For the first time in his life, Alexander Pierce understood what it meant to lose everything without ever knowing it was his. The silence that followed felt almost physical, thick and heavy enough to fill the small flower shop. Alexander stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the little girl who clung to Claire's leg. His mind raced, but no coherent thought formed, only fragments, her eyes, her smile, her laugh echoing faintly in the air. Every detail struck him with painful clarity, and in that moment he knew the truth without needing to ask. He had never believed in fate, but as he looked at the child before him, he felt it crushing him like a wave he couldn't escape. Claire's voice broke through his daze, calm but strained. "You should go," she said softly, her hand gently brushing Lily's hair as if to shield her from the tension. "There's nothing here you need to explain or fix. It's too late." Her words sliced through him more deeply than anger ever could. He opened his mouth, but his voice failed. He wanted to tell her he hadn't known, that if he had, he stopped himself. The excuses sounded hollow even in his mind. For years he had chosen not to look back, not to ask, not to care. He had told himself she was fine, that she had moved on, that what they had meant nothing. But standing there, with his daughter staring up at him with curious, trusting eyes, the weight of every selfish decision came crashing down. He nodded once, barely, then turned and left, the bell above the door echoing like a judgment. Claire sank onto the nearest chair once he was gone, her heart hammering in her chest. Lily tugged at her sleeve, asking innocently, "Mommy, who was that man?" She hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't unravel the fragile piece of their world. "Just someone from a long time ago," she said quietly, forcing a smile. Lily accepted it easily, her attention already shifting to the flowers on the counter. Claire watched her, a mix of love and fear twisting inside her. She had always known this day might come, but she hadn't expected it to hit so hard. Seeing Alexander again had stirred everything she had buried, pain, anger, longing, and yet beneath it all was something she didn't want to name, the faint flicker of what once was. Alexander didn't return to his hotel right away. He walked through the town aimlessly, his thoughts a storm. The sea wind bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. Every street, every sound seemed to mock him. He ended up on the pier, staring out at the horizon, the waves crashing beneath him. He thought of the day he'd walked away from Claire, the arrogance in his words, the cold certainty that he was doing the right thing. It wasn't love, he had said. The memory hit him like a blow. He pressed his hands against the railing, his jaw tightening as he tried to control the shaking that crept through his body. He didn't know how to make sense of what he felt: shock, regret, guilt so raw it almost made him sick. The next morning, he couldn't stay away. He told himself he needed answers, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. He needed to see her again, to see the child who carried his face and her grace. When he walked into the shop, Claire looked up immediately, her expression guarded. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "You said that yesterday," he replied, his voice rough, "and yet here I am." She set down the flowers she'd been arranging and met his gaze directly. "What do you want, Alexander?" He hesitated, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound like lies. "I just want to talk." She let out a humorless laugh. "Talk? After 3 years of silence? After calling me a mistake?" Her voice trembled, but her composure didn't break. "You made your choice, Alexander. You wanted freedom. You got it. Now please, don't drag us back into your world just because you suddenly feel guilty." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I didn't know about her." Claire's eyes flashed with a mix of pain and defiance. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." The truth of her words struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to explain that he had been young and afraid, that he hadn't known how to love her without losing control. But all of that felt too small now, too late. They stood in silence for a long moment until Lily appeared from the back room again, holding a small bunch of daisies. "Look, Mommy, I made you something," she said brightly, then noticed Alexander and smiled at him with the unguarded kindness only a child could give. "Hi." The simple greeting hit him harder than any accusation. "Hi," he managed, his voice barely steady. She tilted her head. "You have the same eyes as me," she said, giggling. Claire's breath caught, and she quickly turned Lily's attention elsewhere. "Sweetheart, why don't you put those in water?" The little girl nodded and skipped off. When she was gone, Alexander spoke quietly. "Please, let me be part of her life." Claire's face hardened. "No. You don't get to decide that now. You had your chance." He took a step closer, desperate now. "She's my daughter." Her voice rose, not in anger but in anguish. "She's my whole world, Alexander. You can't just walk in and claim her because you suddenly remembered how to feel." The room fell silent again, her words hanging heavy between them. He looked at her, realizing she wasn't just angry, she was afraid. Afraid he would take what little stability she had built, afraid he would hurt them again. He swallowed hard and said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." After he left, Claire locked the door and leaned against it, shaking. She didn't know what terrified her more, that he might leave again or that he might stay. She looked at Lily through the glass door to the back room, her daughter humming to herself as she played with the flowers. Claire pressed a hand to her heart and whispered, "I won't let him break us again." But even as she said it, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Alexander spent the night at the hotel unable to sleep, replaying every moment in his mind. The look on Claire's face, the sound of her voice, the innocence in Lily's eyes, they haunted him. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had lost, not just the years apart but the chance to be there for every first word, every birthday, every moment of laughter. He realized that his success had cost him more than he could ever measure. As dawn broke over the ocean, he made a silent promise to himself: he would do whatever it took to make things right. Not to win Claire back, not to erase the past, he knew that was impossible, but to be the father his daughter deserved. What he didn't know was that redemption would demand more from him than he had ever given to anyone, and that love, the kind he had once dismissed as weakness, would soon test him in ways no empire ever had. The next days felt like walking through a storm that neither of them could escape. Claire avoided him as best she could, refusing to answer his calls and locking the flower shop early when she saw his car parked nearby. Yet Alexander kept coming back, standing across the street in silence, hoping she would talk to him. He didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't use the force of his power or money. He simply waited. He had spent years commanding the world with words, but now silence was his only weapon, and it terrified him how powerless he felt. He would watch through the glass as she worked, his heart clenching every time Lily ran out to greet a customer or handed Claire a flower, her laughter cutting through him like light through fog. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, but sorry felt too small, too late. One evening after closing, he found the courage to approach her again. She was locking the door when he spoke, his voice low. "Claire, please. Just let me talk." She didn't turn at first, her hand gripping the key, her shoulders tense. "You've already said everything that mattered, Alexander. Years ago." Her voice carried exhaustion rather than anger, and that hurt him even more. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, stepping closer, "but I can try to be here now. For her. For you." She laughed bitterly. "For me? You made it very clear I was a mistake. Remember?" The words cut through him, but he didn't flinch. "I remember every word," he said quietly, "and I regret every single one." She turned then, finally meeting his eyes. "Regret doesn't erase what you did," she said. "It doesn't erase the nights I cried, wondering how I was going to raise a child alone. It doesn't erase the fear, the shame, the way you made me doubt myself. You don't get to show up now and rewrite the story." He nodded slowly, accepting every word like a blow. "I'm not trying to rewrite it," he said. "I'm just asking to be part of what comes next." The sincerity in his voice made her falter for a moment, but then she shook her head. "You don't understand, Alexander. You walk in and out of people's lives like it's a boardroom. You think control fixes everything. But this isn't business. This is a little girl who knows nothing about heartbreak, and I'm not going to let her learn it from you." For a long moment they stood in silence, only the sound of the sea in the distance. He finally said, "Let me prove it, then. You don't owe me trust, but let me earn it." Claire hesitated, torn between anger and the faint ache of something that refused to die. She exhaled slowly. "You can't come near her unless I say so. You don't tell her who you are. Not yet. She's too young to understand." He nodded instantly, the relief washing through him so visibly that it almost broke her resolve. "I promise," he said. In the days that followed, Alexander kept his distance but stayed close enough to keep his promise. He would stop by the shop to buy flowers, sometimes just standing quietly while Claire worked, his presence cautious, almost gentle. At first, she ignored him completely, treating him like any other customer, but over time she began to notice small changes, how he carried himself differently, how he didn't try to dominate the room anymore. He seemed quieter, humbled in a way she never thought possible. One afternoon, when the shop was busy, he saw Lily struggling to reach a vase on a high shelf and instinctively stepped in to help. "Careful," he said softly, holding the vase steady as she grinned up at him. "Thank you, mister," she chirped, and he smiled despite the ache in his chest. Claire watched from behind the counter, her heart conflicted. That night, she sat on her porch, staring out at the dark sea while Lily slept inside. She couldn't deny that Alexander had changed, or at least that he was trying. Still, she didn't trust him. People like him didn't just transform overnight. Yet the way he looked at their daughter, there was something real there, something she hadn't seen before. She wanted to believe it, but believing meant risking everything again, and she wasn't sure she could survive another heartbreak. Meanwhile, Alexander was fighting his own battle. Every encounter with Lily tore at him in ways he couldn't describe. He had faced ruthless competitors, closed impossible deals, stood in rooms full of power and ambition without ever feeling afraid, but now he lived in constant fear of losing something he never really had. He began to visit the town more often, sometimes walking along the boardwalk alone, other times sitting on the same bench near the shop, watching from afar. He didn't approach unless Claire allowed it, respecting the invisible line she had drawn. The patience it required nearly destroyed him, but for the first time, he didn't try to control the outcome. He just waited, learning what it meant to love without owning. One rainy evening, Claire found him sitting outside the shop, drenched, holding a small bouquet wrapped clumsily in paper. "You'll catch pneumonia," she said sharply, stepping closer with an umbrella. He looked up at her, his hair plastered to his forehead, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to bring these," he said, handing her the flowers. "For Lily." She took them hesitantly. "You could have left them at the door," she said, but her tone softened. "You don't have to do this." He smiled faintly. "I know. But I want to." Something in that quiet exchange shifted between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but the ice began to crack. Over the next weeks, she allowed him small moments, helping at the shop on weekends, joining them for short walks, sitting with Lily at the park while Claire watched from a distance. To her surprise, he never pushed. He didn't ask for more than she offered. He listened when she spoke, even when her words carried anger or pain, and for the first time, she saw the man beneath the armor, the man who had lost his way and was trying, clumsily, to find it again. One afternoon, Lily ran to him with a drawing in her hand. "Look," she said proudly. "It's you, Mommy, and me." She pointed at the stick figures with bright colors and wide smiles. Alexander felt his throat tighten when he saw a fourth figure standing beside them, drawn with brown hair and blue eyes. "Who's that?" he asked softly. "That's you," she said simply. He looked at Claire, and for a moment, neither of them could speak. It was a small thing, a child's drawing, but it felt like the beginning of something neither of them dared to name yet. For the first time in years, Alexander felt hope, not the kind that came with success or ambition, but the fragile, human kind that lived quietly in the heart. And though Claire still guarded hers, she couldn't deny that something inside her had started to shift too. The walls she'd built to keep him out were beginning to crumble, not from his persistence, but from the tenderness she saw growing in him. The man who once claimed love was weakness was now learning that love was the only strength that could save him. Spring came quietly to the coastal town, washing away the gray heaviness of winter with soft winds and bursts of color from the sea. The flower shop bloomed brighter than ever, its windows filled with tulips and roses that seemed to mirror the quiet healing taking place inside the hearts of those who crossed its threshold. Claire had begun to let her guard down in small, careful ways, though she would never admit it aloud. Alexander's presence had become part of their days, not intrusive but constant, like the tide that came and went with dependable rhythm. He was still cautious around her, never overstepping, never assuming, but each passing week brought new fragments of connection, a shared laugh, a quiet walk, a moment of silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. Lily adored him. To her, he was simply Mr. Alex, the kind man who bought her ice cream and told her stories about faraway cities and buildings that touched the sky. He would pick her up from school sometimes when Claire was busy, and she would chatter endlessly all the way home while he listened, his smile soft and unguarded. Every word she spoke felt like a gift, every laugh a reminder of the years he had missed and could never get back. Watching her grow, hearing her voice call his name, it was both joy and punishment, a constant reminder of the life he had turned away from and was now desperate to reclaim. One evening, after closing the shop, Claire found him waiting outside as the sun dipped low over the horizon. The light caught in his hair, and for the first time she noticed how tired he looked, not the exhaustion of work, but of a man who had carried regret too long. "You've been quiet lately," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He smiled faintly. "I've been thinking." She crossed her arms, trying to sound casual. "That sounds dangerous." He laughed softly, then grew serious. "I've been thinking about how much I missed. About how much time I can never give back." His eyes met hers then, and she saw something raw there, something unhidden. I don't expect forgiveness, Claire. I just want you to know that being here, with you, with her, it's the first time in my life I've felt like I'm where I'm supposed to be. She didn't know what to say. The words hung between them like fragile glass, beautiful but dangerous. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that this man who once broke her heart was no longer the same. Another part whispered caution, reminding her of the nights she cried alone, the promises he never made because he thought love was beneath him. Yet looking at him now, she couldn't deny the truth in his eyes. There was no arrogance left, no distance. Only the quiet, patient ache of a man who had learned humility the hardest way possible. As weeks turned into months, their fragile balance grew into something real. They didn't name it, didn't rush it, but it was there in every gesture. He began helping at the shop more often, learning how to wrap bouquets, how to care for the fragile petals without crushing them. Claire would tease him about his clumsy hands, and he would grin, pretending not to care while secretly proud when he finally got it right. The townspeople had grown used to seeing them together, some whispered, some smiled knowingly, but Claire ignored the gossip. For once, she was living on her own terms. Then one evening, as they walked along the beach with Lily between them, Alexander stopped suddenly. The sky was painted in gold and violet, and the wind carried the sound of waves like a heartbeat. "Claire," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. She turned, confused. "What is it?" He knelt down in the sand, reaching into his coat pocket. For a moment she thought her heart might stop. "Don't," she whispered, half afraid, half breathless. "Please don't do this if it's just out of guilt." He shook his head, eyes steady on hers. "This isn't guilt. This is the one thing in my life I'm certain of." He opened the small box, the sunlight catching on the ring inside. "I used to think love was weakness. I was wrong. It's the only thing that's ever made me want to be better. You and Lily, you're my home." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She had told herself she would never let him close enough to hurt her again, but in that moment, every wall she had built began to fall. Lily looked between them, confused but smiling. "Mommy, are you crying?" she asked softly. Claire laughed through her tears and shook her head. "No, sweetheart. Not really." She looked down at Alexander, her voice trembling. "You broke me once," she said quietly. "And I survived. I built a life without you. But if I say yes now, it's because I want you in the life I've built, not because I need saving." He nodded, his voice rough with emotion. "I wouldn't want it any other way." When she said yes, the sound of the sea rose around them like applause. Lily clapped her small hands, not fully understanding but sensing joy, and the three of them stood there in the golden light, a family not born from perfection but from pain, forgiveness, and a love that had taken years to find its truth. Months later, the flower shop was filled with laughter and sunlight. Claire still worked there every day, but now Alexander often joined her in the mornings before heading to his smaller, quieter office. He had stepped away from the city empire, choosing something simpler, closer to them. Lily's drawings covered the walls, bright with colors and hearts, and the customers always smiled when they saw the three of them together. The town whispered less now, the story had turned from gossip to something like legend, a man who once thought he could buy the world and instead found everything he needed in a small coastal town. Sometimes, when the evenings were calm, Claire and Alexander would sit outside, watching the waves as Lily played nearby. She would rest her head on his shoulder, and he would wrap his arm around her, the silence between them no longer cold but full of peace. He often thought about how easily he could have missed this, how one cruel sentence had almost cost him everything. Every time he looked at Claire and their daughter, he knew that life had given him a second chance, and this time, he wouldn't waste it. Love had once terrified him. Now it grounded him. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in soft light, Alexander Pierce finally understood what it meant to have everything, and it had nothing to do with power.